Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 196, Educating the Anxious Generation. The Choralosophy Book Club is back with a discussion of the book I am currently reading, and I cannot wait to talk to you about it. The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, author of The Coddling of the American Mind and The Righteous Mind, which has been discussed here in another Choralosophy Book Club episode, is currently number one on the New York Times bestseller list. It is making all kinds of buzz at the school district level, buzz amongst parents, and buzz amongst, of course, skeptics online who want to call everything about it a farce. So we're going to discuss some of these ideas. I personally think that this is a must-read for every single parent and teacher that is within the sound of my voice. This book has powerful insights and implications for teachers in addition to parents. I, of course, have my own thoughts related to how the advent of the phone-based childhood, as Dr. Haidt calls it in this book, has impacted my own biological children. But in this episode, I will try mostly to focus on how the book can help teachers truly meet students where they are. It's a thing we say we want to do, but I wonder if we're equipped with this generation. I see a lot of posts from colleagues who are very hard on themselves for what seem to be declining student motivation, low levels of participation, and other negative and noticeable trends of how the kids these days are. Of course, the teacher does hold a power to motivate for good or ill, but we can't do it for them. I highly recommend this episode all the way through as an introduction to this cutting-edge research and analysis. Like I said before, there are skeptics, of course, which we will discuss as well. From the summary of this book, after more than a decade of stability or improvement, the mental health of adolescents plunged in the early 2010s. Rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide rose sharply, more than doubling on many measures. Why? In The Anxious Generation, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt lays out the facts about the epidemic of teen mental illness that hit many countries at the same time. He then investigates the nature of childhood, including why children need play and independent exploration to mature into competent, thriving adults. Haidt shows how the play-based childhood began to decline in the 1980s and how it was finally wiped out by the arrival of the phone-based childhood in the early 2010s. He presents more than a dozen mechanisms by which this great rewiring of childhood has interfered with children's social and neurological development, covering everything from sleep deprivation to attention fragmentation, addiction, loneliness, social contagion, social comparison, and perfectionism. So tune in and have your thinking stimulated and challenged, and then, of course, weigh in yourself on what you think about this book if you've read it, or hopefully I'm going to inspire you to read it without any major spoilers in this episode. Head over to the Choralosophers group on Facebook, or you can go over to choralosophy.substack.com and comment in the Choralosophy community there. So before I get too far into the book, I want to talk a little bit about the choir teacher brain that was spinning in my head when I'm reading this book. In a lot of ways, what we do in ensemble music classrooms, and I will say just broadly in the ensemble music classrooms, in a lot of ways, we could be the cure for the anxious generation. Almost everything Dr. Haidt talks about students needing to do and kids needing to do in order to learn, thrive, and grow, we offer in the ensemble music classroom when it's done well. So I'm going to try to tie that in at the end. Stick around. This is going to be fun. Calling all concert planners. Let's talk about Ludus. It's more than just a ticketing platform. It's a game changer for event management. Picture this: simplified ticketing, seamless marketing, powerful fundraising, and now, brand new this year, volunteer management. All for free to you and your organization. Thousands of organizations trust Ludus, and you should too. Elevate your events with Ludus. Sign up at ludus.com/Choralosophy today and experience the difference. Patreon members really keep this show going financially every month, making sure all the costs are covered out of pocket. But they also get access to my Google folder of goodies, the private podcast feed. They find out who's coming on the show ahead of time, and a variety of other fun little conversations that we're able to have over on the Patreon page. The producers and inner circle at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, Jonah Clixbull, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, DF, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. So I'm going to start with skepticism, actually. And what I'm going to do is talk about probably the most common type of skepticism that I see online from average lay people like myself and like other choir teachers and music teachers and parents who are not people who, like Dr. Haidt, the author of this book, are spending time actually researching the most available and recent information and doing the work that really takes a lot to put together a book like this. But so we'll call this the typical passerby skepticism. And I will put that in the category of scoffing at somebody who says anything about kids these days, because what they'll do is they will say that, well, we've always said that, and kids end up always being fine. So this is an interesting type of feedback because it is, of course, a logical fallacy, even in the first place, to talk about how because something has been true, it will continue to be true. And that's not necessarily true, right? So Dr. Haidt actually has a blog on his Substack, After Babel, that addresses this exact type of skepticism. For centuries, adults have worried about whatever, quote, kids these days are doing. From novels in the 18th century to the bicycle in the 19th, through comic books, rock and roll, marijuana, and violent video games in the 20th century, there are always those who ring alarms, and there are always those who are skeptics for those alarms. So far, the skeptics have been right more often than not. And when they are right, they earn the right to call the alarm ringers alarmists, who have fomented a groundless moral panic, usually through sensational but rare or non-existent horror stories trumpeted by irresponsible media. But the skeptics are not always right. I think it is a very good thing that alarms were rung about teen smoking, teen pregnancy, drunk driving, and the exposure of children to sex and violence on TV. The lesson of The Boy Who Cried Wolf is not that after 2 false alarms we should disconnect from the alarm system. In that story, the wolf does eventually come. So, of course, the moral of that little excerpt from his blog is that just saying that, well, people have complained in the past and rose the alarm about many things that didn't end up coming true. So that's, of course, why the material in this book is not true. And I think that that's pretty lazy. So let's dive into some of the actual ideas that are expressed here in this book. And again, I strongly encourage you to go read this for yourself. I am not going to read the book to you today. That is not the purpose of this podcast. I'm just going to pull out some of the ideas that Dr. Haidt claims. And then I also got some charts and graphs that I will be able to show you as well here in just a minute. So one of the key ideas that Dr. Haidt communicates in this book is that we overprotect children and adolescents in the real world while underprotecting them in the virtual world. And that when he says we, he means Western society, in the Anglosphere countries, in what you would consider to be our cultural ecosystem. So I wonder if you ever see that happening. Do you see kids being overprotected in the real world while being underprotected online? I know I sure do. And I still have memories as a kid of getting home after first grade was over and taking off into the woods and not seeing my parents until dark. I would just go explore. My cousins and brother and friends from the street, we would just disappear into the woods behind our house. And as long as we were back by dinner time or by dark or whatever it was, our parents were blissfully unaware of any of the things that we were doing in the woods. And I sure as heck learned a lot and had some great memories. So I'm going to start right away with just making sure that you are listening to this, understanding what it is that we're actually facing in the Western world. And one of those things is when we say that it's just people complaining about the kids these days, as if there isn't actual evidence that something is actually wrong with the kids these days. There's lots of data showing that the increases in teen mental health issues over the last really 10 years are not tiny bumps. And you're also going to see in the book that you can't really blame it on COVID either. There is something else going on here. So I'm just going to give you some of the alarming statistics to start out the episode. Major depression among teens, ages 12 to 17. For girls, increase of 145% in the last 12 years. For boys, increase of 161%. Mental illness challenges among college students, Anxiety is up 134%. Depression, 106%. ADHD, 72% increase since 2010. Bipolar is up, anorexia is up, substance abuse is up, and schizophrenia even is up. And again, not in small ways. So let's talk about anxiety specifically. Prevalence amongst age 18 to 25 is up 139% over the same time span. Emergency room visits for self-harm for girls is up 188% in this time span. For boys, up 48%. Now, of course, keep in mind, historically, boys have been the bigger suicide risk in terms of actually successfully committing suicide. This 188% spike in girls' self-harm shows you an ahistorical trend. Suicide rates for younger adolescents, we're talking about the kids from 10 to 14 are not immune to this smartphone and screen-based childhood problem. Boys' suicide rates are up 91% amongst younger adolescents. That's 10 to 14, up 91%. Girls, up 167% in that amount of time. And again, these statistics are all from 2010. Okay? Communication technology adoption in that same amount of time. You can see here in this graph, if you're watching on YouTube, I can't read you every aspect of the graph, but, if you're listening audio only, I can't read you every aspect of the graph, but if you are on the YouTube channel, you can see these things as I scroll. So when are we adopting all of these technologies, right? In 1925, the radio comes out. We're talking about the late 50s for TV, when people are starting to get TVs. And then you get the internet boom and the personal computer, and lots of technology adoption gets bundled into less and less time. And we're all very familiar with this idea, and we, especially Gen Xers like me, we've seen it all happen. We've seen this whole personal computer to the internet explosion and how that has changed. What we sometimes forget, though, is that the technology now is changing at a rate that is unprecedentedly high, way faster than what we experienced as kids. And the reason we don't notice it is because the technology doesn't look that different on the outside. But the technology under the hood, so to speak, is changing rapidly. So another chart here on teenage depression versus adult unemployment, which is an interesting statistic. The U.S. unemployment rate, percent of adults in the labor market who are unemployed, fell continuously as the adolescent mental health crisis got worse. So one of the key points of a lot of skeptics for this kind of data is that, it's not the phones causing kids to become mentally unhealthy. It's because they're poor. It's because they're oppressed. It's because they are facing this challenge or that challenge. The economic argument for this doesn't really hold up when you think about the changing in unemployment rate over that amount of time and the general standard of living increasing over that amount of time for the average person. Excellent or very good mental health for Canadian women also fell 30%. This is not just a U.S. problem. Self-harm episodes for UK teens are up 78% in girls, up 134% in boys. Mental health hospitalizations in Australia are up 81% for girls, up 51% for boys. The Nordic nations, high psychological distress for girls, up 76%, boys up 50%. Alienation in school. This is worldwide, feeling like they are alienated. Worldwide school alienation scores over time. Note that the increase in school loneliness occurs in all regions other than Asia, mostly between 2012 and 2015. Then you see this huge spike upwards. So I just can't help but notice that this is also about the time when we started talking about how important belonging was in school. This is sadly very damning evidence to whether or not those programs are working. But that is a side note, probably for another podcast. But when those types of programs started coming into schools, we started talking about belonging a lot. But the result of whether or not kids feel like they belong I've seen it in my own school, but I also see it in the data, is that we are not making things better with those conversations. Something about the conversation is not working. So then we get into some of the other cultural data here. The amount of so one of the things that Dr. Haidt does say is that he is really not making the claim that it is a one cause thing. Like, because kids are on smartphones, all these bad things are happening. He is making the argument, though, that it does show up in the data that this is one of the causes. And there's causal data, and I'll let him. I'm posting some links in the show notes, and you can, again, I don't want this episode to be a spoiler, but I want you to go read the book, because this is really where you'll start to understand. But this is not just a U.S. problem. It is not a cell phone only problem. These things are happening in the culture everywhere. So when we were kids, again, we had to play with each other. We had to, in order to have any kind of fun or social life after school, you had to be at a friend's house or out in the alley or at a sports practice. The percentage rate is tumbling of kids who actually meet up in person with their friends daily. We are bumping down to about 20% of kids meet with one of their friends every day. And obviously, this is not a good situation. We are in an era when I sometimes question whether or not people are really paying attention to the world around them when they deny that these things are peculiar with this generation. I see it every single day in class. I see differences in how kids were 10 years ago, 5 years ago. These addictions to screens are showing results in the classroom. I think about how quickly kids in a room full of 30, 40 kids, if given free time, how quickly the cell phones come out. Some do play with each other. Absolutely. Some do. If they have playtime or free time, they will play cards, they will talk about inappropriate things or whatever it is that teenagers do. But a very large percentage of the kids, those phones come out instantly. As soon as there's not something in the class for them to do at that moment, the phones come out instantly. And so this can't be just a coincidence. And so what the book does is it tries to make the case that it is not a coincidence, and it is not just being an alarmist about kids these days. There really is an issue that's worth exploring. Choralosophy listeners will remember RyanMain.com, but he has recently created EndeavorMusicPublishing.com, which is something different, something bigger, and something better. Endeavor is not a marketplace. It's a traditional publisher with a 21st century business model, which means that they have editing. Each piece is chosen and selected with accessibility in mind. Endeavor supports composers with a majority of the sales going right to the composer. Plus, there are tons of voicings to fit the needs of your program, instant downloads, full recordings, practice materials, and more. So head over to EndeavorMusicPublishing.com now and check out the catalog. I am really excited to announce, after many requests, there is now a Choralosophy merch store. All you need to do is go to the website, choralosophy.com, look for the shop button in the top. You can find Literacy is Equity shirts and sweatshirts and signs for your room. You can find the Thank You for Your Mistake signs, which I love to put on the wall of a classroom, as well as a variety of other show designs, and you can sport your Choralosopher status by going to choralosophy.com/shop and checking out the store there. One of the most outspoken and qualified critics of Dr. Haidt's work is Candace Odgers, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Here is an article in Nature that she wrote, kind of rebutting the conclusions that Jonathan Haidt is making here. Now, two things need to be said. This is from Candace Odgers. Two things need to be said after reading The Anxious Generation. First, this book is going to sell a lot of copies because Jonathan Haidt is telling a scary story about children's development that many parents are primed to believe. Second, the book's repeated suggestion that digital technologies are rewiring our children's brains and causing an epidemic of mental illness is not supported by science. Worse, the bold proposal that social media is to blame might distract us from effectively responding to the real causes of the current mental health crisis. So in her mind, she is one of the folks that are making this argument that the It's really the economy, stupid. It's the economy that is causing, and and the presence of injustice in the world, and that there's racism. Did you know that? And there's also sexism, and that's actually why kids' mental health has plummeted suddenly since 2012, because apparently bad economies, sexism, and racism only started happening in 2012. It's a very odd argument to me. So there are some very interesting points that she makes. She has studied uh, this topic as well. So has Dr. Haidt, but their opinions are still different, which is why I think it's very fascinating. Um, Now, one of the things that Candace Odgers also says is that this is a complex problem. There are unfortunately no simple answers. The onset and development of mental disorders such as anxiety, depression are driven by a complex set of genetic environmental factors. Suicide rates among people in most age groups have been increasing steadily for the last 20 years. Researchers cite access to guns, exposure to violence, structural discrimination and racism, sexism, sexual abuse, the opioid epidemic, economic hardship, and social isolation as leading contributors. Well, that's interesting because as we discussed, all those bad things have always existed. So that's a very strange thing to blame it on. And also, where do we think the increased social isolation is coming from? Kids are online. They are online. So the skepticism and parents being primed to believe this. I wonder if this person is a parent, because we've seen these things happen over the last 15 years. My daughter's 16 years old. I've watched it happen. Kids today are not this. They're not the same amount of present in the moment as kids before the what Dr. Haidt calls the rewiring of childhood. I am very sympathetic with the idea that kids' brains are being rewired. We now know a lot about what is going on when we play video games and check pings on our phones and respond to these little dopamine hits. We have never had access to this much dopamine in this short of amount of time as when we're playing these online video games and when we're checking our notifications on Facebook. We are becoming addicted to a chemical. It's not the screen that we're being addicted to. We are becoming addicted to the chemical of dopamine that is being injected into our brains. Now, think about, I mentioned before in the intro, what we do in ensemble music. We put down the screens. The screens are really nowhere involved in our class. There's no social media involved. There's not texting to each other. We are live and present in the moment. We also have to spend quite a bit of time and effort and work to get just one of those dopamine hits. So we're teaching kids delayed gratification in a lot of ways. Now, the problem is, as soon as we give them downtime in a music class, the phones come out right away because they've got to get that hit of dopamine. And I sometimes wonder if people really understand that that is what is going on. We are addicted to the chemical that surges in our brain when we have these little rewards online. And what's happening right now is that kids are getting those rewards so much easier online than they are in real life. So there is no incentive for their addicted brains essentially to come offline. Right now, these are just trends, right? So I talk about that. I feel like I say this on this show until I'm blue in the face. These are all just averages. Now, this criticism from Candace Odgers is a very interesting criticism, and I do also have a blog here from Jonathan Haidt in response to this. Um, but in the book, as I'm reading it, I don't hear him making the argument at all that this is just caused by one thing. In fact, he doesn't even say it's caused just only by the phones. And so she's responding here to a bit of a straw man, because the argument in the book, if it's very easy if you're reading the book, which I again recommend, is that he's not saying that in a perfect world, the cell phone was dropped into the hand of a kid and this caused our brains to be rewired. That's not what he's saying. He is saying that he believes that he is presenting evidence in the book that is a cause. That is one of the causes. Nothing in nature is just caused by one thing, right? So I think these are very weak criticisms so far. There are some valid points. One of the points is that two things can be independently true about social media. First, that there is no evidence that using these platforms is rewiring children's brains or driving an epidemic of mental illness. Second, that considerable reforms to these platforms are required given how much time young people spend on them. Now, this is an interesting admission here. I find this very interesting. So, one of Dr. Haidt's arguments is that kids are spending too much time and forsaking other experiences. So this is the misunderstanding here. She's admitting that kids are spending too much time. Maybe even legislation should happen regarding it. But that is also the argument that John Haidt is making here. So, for example, if I'm saying cell phones are causing this, well, it's not like magic. It's not just the dopamine hits, right? The dopamine hits cause kids to make different choices. They cause kids to stay online longer. Well, what do they miss out? There's an opportunity cost. Is the ability to look for opportunity cost is the thing here. It's not just that they're on the phone. It's what are they not experiencing while they're on the phone? And multiply that times many, many minutes and the seconds of the day and then days of the week and then years of kids' lives are not experiencing things in the real world. What kind of effect will that have on them? And we're not saying that we know the answer, but to say that this is not potentially a pretty detrimental change to the way kids are being raised, I think that could be unprecedented. There, even just the way a book works, for example, you could say, well, yeah, but people were saying the same types of things as when books came out. Well, but books don't give us the dopamine hits. Like you have to. It's more similar to the real world. It's a little bit sped up, I guess, but you've got to get to page 56 or whatever before that moment that has been being built up to in the story arrives, and you get that little entertainment burst, right? Kids can go in an hour and get 100 of those moments. And why would they spend time in the real world? They're not motivated to do that. So I think that yes, you should absolutely be skeptical of whether or not the evidence presented in this book is like proof in the way that a lot of times we think of what does it mean to have it be proven. It means that there's no possibility that John Haidt is wrong. I definitely don't think that. I think there's always possibility somebody is right or wrong or mixtures of that. But this is interesting because I think we all see these things happen. Now, on John Haidt's blog after Babel, there is a response to that article in Nature where he kind of lays out some of the things that I just pointed out, which is that one, we're not really saying, John Haidt's not saying, I'm not saying that the phone is the one thing, right? It's the phone plus all of the other ways that we aren't experiencing our childhoods in ways that are developmentally necessary. Okay, so let's go into the classroom now. So as I'm reading this book and I'm internalizing some of the data and some of the charts, I'm also comparing it to my own kids. Like I said at the beginning, I see these things, the anxiety from Instagram. I see the anxiety from not being able to get online quick enough for my son to play video games because he's missing out on the time that he would have with friends. But while he's making that choice, he is of course, missing out on chances to practice his swing for baseball or practice his clarinet or do things that are longer payoff, like a delayed gratification. He doesn't want to do those things because he can get the gratification instantly online. Now, gaming for boys, by the way, is very similar to other social media for girls on average. Like that's where they hang out. That's where if they're not in the chat room, then they're being left out. Whereas if let's say a girl again, typically if they're not on Instagram, they're being left out. So how is this going to happen? How is this going to affect the classroom? In what ways have you seen it in affecting the classroom already? Now, the book again says that we overprotect children and adolescents in the real world and underprotect them in the virtual world. In what ways do we see this happening in the classroom? Now, I see it in just a higher than normal, higher than the past, I should say, amount of anxiety towards trying new things related to music, to putting themselves out there for criticism, for growth, for building. That is dramatically different than it was 5, 6 years ago. Another question: what problems do smartphones and social media solve in our classroom? What problems do they create? In my mind, they create way more than they solve. So we maybe should be thinking about advocating in our schools for no phones. And I know we've wrung our hands about this now for 10 or 15 years. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Oh, but the kids want their phones. They need their phones. There are a lot of places now going phone free. at school, as in you're not even allowed to bring them to school. And I think it's worth a look. I really, really do. I think if the kids can have 8 hours of every one of their days unplugged from the matrix, even if they can just get those 8 hours, what other n- n- connections can they start to build during those 8 hours? Then I think about tech rules and how they affect our classroom management. How does that change if we don't have phones in school at all? What rules around phones are you comfortable enforcing in your class? Would your administrators support you? What school-wide tech rules would you implement if you were given the opportunity? For me, it would be no phones. They don't even come in the backpack. Don't bring them to school. We have been reached at school to find kids and get kids out for appointments since way before cell phones existed. There are other ways to get in touch with kids, and I think we have become addicted to the instant communication. But it doesn't that's not really the point. It's not so parents can't reach kids. It's so the kids have to unplug. Now, are there in between possibilities there? Could the phone come to school, but there are strict rules about it coming out of the backpack during class? But again, I would even say the phones shouldn't be out during the passing period either. They shouldn't be out during playtime. They shouldn't be out during the kids should be forming connections in the real world with each other. It's a crucial skill even in an increasingly online world. It's a crucial skill for their emotional and social development. Do you feel like the smartphone influences the way parents are involved in your classroom? Are they nosier now? Do they do they seem to know, like, want to be up on every little detail of what's going on in your program? Well, in a lot of ways, they should know certain things, and in a lot of ways, kids need to be free while they're in school to just try to make it on their own without mom or dad checking in on all the details. So again, I think these are things people know, but I don't know that how much we are prior to this book kind of busting out on the scene a few weeks ago. I'm not sure that we've really been wrapping our head around the connection between this device and some of the ways the world feels like it's melting in the last 15 years. The social fabric specifically melting. Our ability to communicate with each other like as if we have seen the same reality is gone. Like that doesn't exist. I don't know where these things come from. I do know that the only reason we have that like quick impression of is this my team or the other team is that we have learned to do that through our phones in way more expansive ways than we have in the past. So, in other words, we have learned, yes, we have figured out some ways to include people because of digital technology, but we've also gotten way better, and not in a good way better at excluding people through these online technologies. So I find that aspect of it fascinating too, and I'm not really sure if that's more of an adult thing. But because of course kids' lives are still a little bit more local than adults are in terms of our networks because we're on social media for business, for marketing, those types of things. These things in a lot of ways, guys, have just never been tried on humans before. And in a lot of ways, we're living in an experiment. So I hope this conversation can stimulate some of your thinking. But what I really hope is that you'll go read this book. There's an audiobook as well. It comes with a free PDF of the graphs, and I just scratched the surface in this conversation because I said I didn't want to spoil it. I don't want to give you the. I'm not going to explain as well as he does the actual evidence for why he thinks that there's causal link here between the increase of online gaming and social media and these mental health issues, but the evidence is really quite compelling, I find. But again, as long as you're not trying to find a one cause situation. Because yeah, if you're going to try to prove that this is only because of cell phones, then I don't think that's provable. But to say that there's a contribution here, I completely agree. I think it should change the way that we teach. It should change the way that we deliver instruction. It also should change the grace that we give ourselves for struggling to break through to kids because they are wired differently. What can you offer me? I think that's what kids do now. Why should I listen to you? How are you going to make it worth my time? And that's not a good thing, by the way. I've seen that attitude of teenagers being celebrated as if, oh yeah, kids are finally standing up for themselves against those oppressive teachers. No, no, that's not a good thing. We want kids to come to school excited and open to learning. They can be taught to be that way. And so I think the difference now is that when an adult offers a kid something, that kid has to compare it in their mind to whatever their addiction is on the phone. Oh, you want to try this extra choir thing? Oh, that's less Fortnite time. I can't do that. Or I don't know. I really like to hang out in my room and scroll Instagram all day. And that is so satisfying for them that I see kids, and many have admitted this to me, that this is what they think about at all day long at school, is when can I get back online? When can I get out of school so I can get back to my bed so I can scroll Instagram? Or when can I get out of school so that I can go play Fortnite with my bros? And that's where all my friends will be, and they'll be at home on their couches after school too, playing these video games. So there is um it's very difficult for me to wrap my mind around the idea that this is not, at the very least, uh, pretty bad news that should require our education of ourselves. We should educate ourselves about this evidence, and then, if we feel bold enough, advocate for some action in our local communities. Thank you all for listening to this episode. As always, the way that we keep Choralosophy moving into the future. We just hit 5 years, and the way we hit 5 more years and continue to grow and expand, the way that this platform can be valuable to you, the listener, and can continue to be valuable to the music education landscape, is you being involved. The ways that you can be involved, of course, are entering the Choralosophy promo code at all the websites that allow that. They are amazing partners that have been with us mostly since the beginning. That's SightReadingFactory.com, MyMusicFolders.com. That is also EndeavorPublishing.com and GraphitePublishing.com. You can also, of course, go over to Ludus and check out their products. You can do the things directly for the show that help, like go to patreon.com/Choralosophy and chip in $3 a month. And if you can't do any of those things, I just want you to join the conversation. So head on over to the Choralosophers Facebook page, like, share, leave comments anywhere that you're able to see the content. Those help other people see the content and join the conversation as well. We are building a movement here, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.